Please welcome your host for this evening, Dr. Lindsay Hoffman.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at the 12th Annual National Agenda Speaker Series here at the Gore Recital Hall at the University of Delaware. We're here thanks to the University of Delaware's Center for Political Communication with generous support from the College of Arts and Sciences. Every fall, we tackle a different theme related to what's happening in this country. This year's theme is politics by the numbers. Yesterday, we saw a massive turnout in states across the nation for this country's midterm elections. There are some surprises, some differences from predictions, and some predictions that were dead on. Tonight's guests will help us understand how to interpret polling and election results with a focus on the newest generation of voters, Gen Z. As usual, we'll be inviting audience participation at the end of the talk, but I'd like to remind our audience that civil dialogue is vital to the success of National Agenda. So let's agree to be candid, but also courteous of others' views. I'll open it up for Q&A in the last half hour, and our student volunteers will be helping you ask questions through the microphone and direct you back to your seat. Don't forget, all of our previous programming is available to watch on our website at cpc.udel.edu. My conversation with Indigenous photojournalist and an Indigenous photojournalist and a graphics editor for the New York Times was absolutely fascinating, looking at how you bring art and creativity and graphic design into the understanding of the problems facing our country. We also featured voices this year from two former Blue Hens, Washington Post senior congressional correspondent Paul Kane and an editor for The Atlantic, Nora Kelly Lee. I'm so pleased to welcome back to the National Agenda stage John Della Volpe, Director of Polling at Harvard's Kennedy School of Institute of Politics. In 2020, John served as a pollster and strategic communications advisor to the Biden-Harris campaign. The Washington Post called him one of the world's leading authorities on global sentiment, opinion, and influence, especially among young people. He's the author of the critically acclaimed new book, Fight, which I happen to have a copy of, How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. Signed copies will be available for you to purchase in the lobby after the talk. He also appears regularly on MSNBC's Morning Joe and the 11th Hour. Please give a big Blue Hen welcome back to the University of Delaware to John Della Volpe.
Thank you.
Thank you. But we have another speaker. Please have a seat. We are also joined tonight by a representative of that generation that showed up to the polls in the midterm, Jing-Jing Shen. She's a Harvard University senior who served as the 2021 chair of the Harvard Public Opinion Project. She became interested in gun violence issues, mental health activism while still in high school in Cleveland, Ohio. She joined Harvard Public Opinion Project as a freshman because she was fascinated with poll data. Beyond the numbers, she was even more intrigued by the stories that underlie people's perspectives. Shen also volunteers as a crisis text line counselor and researches renewable energy, sustainable development, and global mental health. These two speakers will help us unpack the most recent midterm elections from the perspectives of Gen Z voting attitudes and behaviors. Please also welcome to the stage Jing-Jing Shen. Thank you so much for being here. So let's get right to it. The midterm elections. This is kind of the story of the day. This must have been a big day for you guys and last night watching the returns. What were some things that you expected and what were some things that surprised you?
Well, again, thank you for having me. It's great to be back on campuses. It's been so many. This is the first place I came to talk about my book last semester, which I appreciate, and I always enjoy spending time here with your students, Lindsay, and also as a fellow at the SNF, as an SNF fellow at the Biden Institute. So I just really want to say thank you to having me back. I was thinking about this election over the last several weeks, not sure by looking at all the data, honestly, whether we were going to see a blue wave or a red wave. But I was pretty sure when we started to look at our 44th survey that we were going to see a Gen Z wave. I was sure of that. And the reason I felt so confident is that well before Dobbs, well before this election season, when Gen Z came of age in 2018, they did things that no previous generation that we've studied has done. They voted at essentially twice the level of the baby boomer, the millennial, and the Gen X generation in the 2018 midterms. They continued that in 2020. So I think, more sure than others that we would see this wave. What I wasn't convinced of is the extent to which it would transform the election cycle. For example, unlike 2018, 2020, there were more undecided young people. Persuasion was going to be a more important element of the campaign cycle rather than just mobilization. So what I was really looking for was not just will young people show up, but what would be the margin, and would it be enough to essentially kind of cover the significant deficits that in particular Democrats had among folks over the age of 40. So that's kind of how I was looking at things. But to be honest, we weren't surprised, we weren't shocked. The Harvard poll, youth poll, designed by Jing-Jing and a couple of dozen other students, we were, exit polls had about a 28-point Democratic advantage among the under 30s. I think our final number was about 26. So we're kind of right there, and that's how we processed everything last night.
So you must be feeling pretty good today.
Feeling tired, but good, yeah.
You, unlike some other pollsters, you really sort of identified that this young generation was going to turn out in ways that maybe weren't expected.
And honestly, it's frustrating from our point of view, because a lot of members of our broader community said, yeah, we'll see it, we'll believe it when we see it. And young people always say that. And what I had been saying is, listen, for the last 40 years, if you bet on young people kind of disappointing on election night, you would have been probably right more than you were wrong, right? But again, that's when older generations were younger. Since 2018, it's a complete game changer. Donald Trump, the combination of Donald Trump and the Parkland students, I think really changed the dynamic of this generation. In the book, we talk about the values and the reasons why, but I think it's just really important that we focus on the present dynamics and not rely so much on that conventional wisdom, frankly, from models that are a century old, right?
Yeah. Well, so Jing-Jing, I'd like to toss it over to you as a member of this generation. What were some things that you were looking for in the midterm elections yesterday, and what are some things that maybe you were like, yeah, I expected that to happen, and some things that maybe you were like, that sort of took me by surprise?
Absolutely. I think, first of all, thank you all so much for coming and for the opportunity to speak here. It's an honor. John really captured the sentiment of young people and their motivations to turn out extremely well. I think how I would succinctly put it is, young people this cycle really recognized that all that was at stake this election was on the ballot. And so when you're looking at fundamental foundations of our society and our lives that have historically been taken for granted, rights to abortion, our democracy, climate change, gun reform, like all of these different factors really coalesced in energizing young people to turn out and to vote. And that's been very impactful. An interesting juxtaposition in numbers that I think brought some people to doubt the power of youth was that only 4% of our young American respondent base, so 18 to 29-year-olds, this year characterized the US as a healthy, strong, functioning democracy. And yet when you look at the expected turnout amongst that same demographic, it was at 40%. And so there's this question of how can you have people who are maybe disillusioned with the state of our nation and the direction of our politics. Biden's own approval numbers were just dipping from spring 2021 at 59% amongst youth to 39% now. And yet you have this turnout. It really shows you have this democratic trifecta in control of our government, but these issues really galvanized youth, and they recognized everything that was at stake and at risk, and they turned out, and you see a faith in and resolve to participate in the process because we believe in it. And hopefully that faith in democracy will increase as a result of this generation.
Well, so I can't go without saying that you guys newly dropped your fall 2022 poll, your 44th poll at Harvard Institute of Politics. And I thought it was fun. Yesterday, some students released a video featuring students quizzing other students on campus to see if they could tap into what is driving Gen Z's political attitudes and behaviors this midterm. So I want to start with the question for the audience. One of the questions that you guys asked was, what issue do you think was most important in determining young Americans to vote in the midterms of 2022? So I'd like to turn it over to the audience. Just shout it out. What's one issue you think drove young people 18 to 29 years old to vote yesterday in record numbers? Abortion, okay. That was definitely one of them. Gun control. Climate change. Democracy was definitely one of them. So, what's that? The economy. So all those things. I think the top three, the first one was inflation, the second one was protecting democracy, and the third was abortion. So these are issues that were incredibly important to young folks. I'm going to keep doing this. I think this is fun. What percentage of young Americans said that they believe that their rights are under attack today in America? 70, 75, that's a lot. 67. 60, that's very specific, 67. It's a little bit lower, it's 59%. 59% of young Americans believe that their rights are under attack. And what's interesting when you ask the question of the rights of others, that number jumps to 73%, right? So when they're concerned about rights of others. Indulge me, I'm going to do this a little bit more. What percentage of young Americans
We should be filming this, yeah. I guess we are, but we should be doing it for
We are.
yeah.
So I think you kind of alluded to this, Jing-Jing, but I don't know if you gave the exact percentage. What percentage of young Americans believe what percentage of young Americans believe American democracy is healthy? We know they don't think it's very healthy, but they showed up. What percent? 4%. Lauren, you got it, 4%. And then we saw that at the same time, like you said, Jing-Jing, 40% of young Americans said they intended to vote. So, John, help us break down those numbers compared to what we actually saw yesterday. What do we know today in terms of young people's turnout and how that matches their intended participation?
So we're not going to know, honestly, until members of the political science community, Census Bureau, numbers crunchers really kind of carefully look at everything. What we do know is that, for context, twice as many turned out in 2018 as 2014. Twice as many in a midterm election, highest ever. That number was in the mid-30s, okay? Based upon what source you're looking at, mid-33, 35, 36%. I don't know the exact number of young people who turned out yesterday, and talked to a lot of reporters, whether it was 25%, 35%, or 45%. My shorthand answer was, it was enough, right? It was enough young people to stop what would have been that red wave. So that's, it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard to calculate. What we had seen and what I believe we also saw on the ground is that in battleground states, that number was even higher than it was in the traditionally red states or blue states. So this is going to be a complex issue to understand. But what's, I think, a noteworthy point is when we started this project 20 years ago, there was really no significant generation gap in American politics. A younger person, an older person voted at the exact same rate, at the exact same level in terms of Democrats versus Republicans in the 2000 presidential election, 2002, similar. It's been over the last 20 years that this generation gap has become one of the more important things to understand American politics.
Right, it was more about, gender and political party and other types of
race, ethnicity, et cetera. But I think we're clearly in a country that's divided 50-50, but the real divide is based upon your age. And this is the third cycle in a row where folks under 40 voted strong Democrat, folks over 40 voted the other way. What's interesting is we now have these two generations, Gen Z as well as millennials, who will outvote baby boomers in this next cycle. Right? We will likely have 40%, close to 40% of the next presidential cycle of the electorate be composed of members of these two generations, and over 60%. Well, again, we'll figure out in the next several days, 63, 65% of people under 30, those two generations, voted blue. Down the street in Pennsylvania, over 70% voted for John Fetterman. You know, young people played a critical role in every single state. With the role of social media and the internet generally, you know, blue states and red states, it's just not as it's not as relevant when we're talking about young people, right? A young person often saying Lexington, Kentucky has as much in common with someone from Lexington, Massachusetts, even though a red state versus a blue state. So we really need to think about the lack of borders and understand that young people are young people wherever they live. The last presidential election, the only two states of significance that the Republican Trump would have won were Tennessee and Indiana. The rest of them would have been blue, just based upon the votes of younger millennials and Gen Zers.
So Jing-Jing, could you maybe talk to that? What is it that sort of feels like there's two kind of things to think about here. So of course there's a lot of students who are voting blue, your young people who are voting blue, but as Andrew, one of my students pointed out, there's also 60% of young Americans that did not plan to vote. And there's clearly a portion of both those voting and not voting who are conservative or are on the red side. So what's your take, Jing-Jing, on the conservative students, conservative young people in Gen Z in this country? Where are they? Are they motivated to vote in the same way that young Democrats are?
I think fundamentally, young Democrats, young Republicans, young independents, we're living in the same America, and we confront a lot of the same issues, ranging from concerns about mental health and inflation to worries about LGBTQ+ rights and the future of the planet alongside that of our democracy. So there's a lot of shared struggles on many fronts. What's interesting is that for the breakdowns of the youth electorate by partisan affiliation, we've seen the Democratic share of that steadily grow over the last decade or so, even though the fraction of that is comprised of young Republicans has stayed steady at around 30%. So that's an interesting dynamic to see the Democratic Party's vision for the future of America seems more closely aligned with the values that young people have. As an example of this, just this past summer, we saw a slew of legislation passed by the Democrats. So you had the bipartisan gun reform law, in addition to the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as student loan debt cancellation. And in each of those cases, a majority of Americans said that America would be better because of these initiatives and actions. And I think that speaks a lot to really how consistent the platform of the Democrats is with what young people are looking for in this moment. Now, it's not hopeless for the conservatives and the Republican Party. It's really about aligning interests with what young people desire. So another really valuable statistic to keep in mind is that for both young Democrats and young Republicans, 3 in 5 of each of those groups said that they were voting more for their own party rather than in opposition to the other. So it's not just about recognizing on the Democratic side, okay, there's the potential for a red wave and like, what do we do about it? And for the Republicans, like a referendum on the Democrats means we have to really base all of our stances on what is wrong with the party in power. A lot of that is just who is best representing my voice and my interests. And young people across the aisle have really emphasized that to us.
So less about maybe what is appealing to and persuasive to older audiences, which is the other guy's the enemy, but it's more about, okay, what can you do for me? So I think I'm going to pull up, I warned you, John, that I've been tweet stalking you. You posted this. This is the Harvard Youth Poll, Shape of the Midterm Elections. You were looking at likely voters and the sort of the number of people who say they definitely vote over these different years. Tell me about what you see in this graph and what it means to you to look at those intentions to vote across those different years.
So I have several graphs with similar data points that I've tweeted the last 3 or 4 weeks. And the reason I tweeted them is because I was unsure whether the reporters in the political community appreciated that we shouldn't be surprised that this is a new chapter. And as you can see in this data, in 2010 and 2014, 27 to 26% of young people on the left-hand side said they would definitely vote. Gen Z enters the equation in 2018, and you can see 40% indicated they would likely vote. Most people recognize that was a high watermark. That was record level turnout, not only for all Americans, but specifically for this generation. Younger people turned out at such a high number that they increased their share, which means that while everyone voted, there were more younger people in the electorate, and therefore the influence of older people actually went down.
And speaking of water, I'm going to show the next one, which was the Gen Z wave.
Yes.
Oops.
Oh, and then that the 2022.
Okay. Hang on.
Sorry. Yeah.
There it is.
Right. There you go. And the Gen Z wave. This was when a reporter says, "I'll believe it when I see it." And I said, "I'm literally showing to you right now. It looks like a wave." This data goes all the way back to the 1986 midterms, and you can see 2018. It looks like a wave. The same number of people in this survey said they were going to vote as last survey. That's why we were so confident. So I literally, on a Saturday morning, literally had to draw it out for some people.
So
I get problems, but that's what I did.
So one of my students, Gabriella, and a lot of my students have been asking, so do you expect this wave to continue beyond the midterms? Do you see this as a continual increase, or are we going to see some sort of stabling off?
I think it depends. We saw little spikes there, pre and post 9/11, pre and post, Clinton, et cetera, but they lasted a cycle till they dipped off. We don't know, but I'm not expecting this to dip in a significant way, right? We've now seen 3 election cycles, but beyond election cycles, think about, right, our conversations on this campus. Think about the rates of registration. Think about the activities and the protests and the organizing, how important these issues are to people. So as long as we have administrations that continue to listen and engage, I'm hopeful that we'll continue just to build upon this. But think about this: once you're in this system, we have got 50% more young people in the system today than we did a generation ago, right? They will be even more active in those communities at an earlier age. And I think the more activity among a better representation, the better everybody, the better we all are.
So let's go back to this most recent poll that just dropped a couple of weeks ago. Maybe, Jing-Jing, you can take this. This question comes from a student, Callie. Can the trends among young voters be seen from young people in both urban and rural areas? What are some of the differences between students across those different regional perspectives?
Sure. It's a really important question, since we know that young people come from different backgrounds, and that includes geographically. Ultimately, I think news source is a prominent difference amongst these different groups, in which for those who are more keyed into the news, especially following the policies of the administration and how Biden has really acted upon his promises to young people, his approval is actually much higher than general. So for those who don't follow the news, we see that number at around 28% approval. But for those who do, that number jumps by 20 percentage points to 48%. So where you get your news is really a key factor. But in addition to that, you also have the particular sources that youth are drawing upon. And we're increasingly seeing a reliance and interest in following media, social media, Instagram, and TikTok in particular. So although the composition of cities might differ across these geographic locations, you also have an opportunity to connect with people regardless of where they physically are located if you can tap into where young people are turned in. And for many, that lies in social media.
So a couple of my students also have questions for if you all are interested in the next generation that comes after Gen Z. They're called, does anyone know? Alpha, Generation Alpha. So do you have any, this is for either of you, do you have any predictions for how Generation Alpha may grow up to be different from Gen Z? And Ryan in particular wants to know, where do you think Gen Z will be in terms of political activism and progress in 10 years? So Gen Alpha is being born approximately they're still being born, 2015, 2025. And these aren't hard and fast years. Right. But what are you seeing in terms of, I know you're not polling young people in Alpha yet, but what are your expectations or predictions?
So we're polling outside of Harvard. I'm polling at high schools a lot, right? And right, keep in mind that not all of Gen Z is the age of 18. But when we think about generations, I don't know if we know yet, because I'm not the kind of person who says you have to be born on this day, on this month, on this year to be a member of this generation. We talked about the fluidity of generations. It's really about this collective experience that a group of adolescent folks have, right? And the importance of those events in their lives and the lives of all of us as Americans, and the centrality of those, and how they shape your values, not just for the moment or for your early years, but for the rest of your life. This generation of Gen Z, I argue, has had to deal, as you all know, with more trauma more quickly than any generation since the greatest generation. Thinking about these experiences coming of age in the wake of 9/11, the Great Recession, response to Katrina, school shooter drills, opioid crisis, climate change, concerns about sexual violence, concerns about climate change, we could go on. That ending up with this horribly sad spike in death by suicide among younger people when your generation is turning into adolescence. That's before COVID, all of which was exacerbated by social media. So those are among the critical factors that have shaped Generation Z. So honestly, from where I sit, we certainly understand that COVID and the response of COVID and the lack of social interactions that many members of Gen Alpha are dealing with will be a component, but I think we just need to, as we talked about at dinner, be a little bit more patient before we think about the larger ramifications.
Okay. So I still want to stay on this poll because like I said, these data just dropped. What about, we know inflation was one of the most important issues for not just young people, but people across the country, across age groups. Can you, and maybe Jing-Jing, if you want to pick up on this, or either of you, can you describe Gen Z's view on the economy? And there were a lot of interesting questions on their own financial lives and how they see themselves at their parents' age, what they see themselves looking like in the future financially. And maybe, John, you can give us some idea of how that differs or is similar from previous generations of young people.
Yeah, so I'll start with, so as you said, inflation, cost of living, that was certainly the number one issue, both volunteered as well as chosen from the poll. And it's something that we've been hearing well before the last year in terms of this concern about cost of living. And I remember a focus group that we did just a few years ago where we asked young people, what is your version of the American dream? And oftentimes it's as simple as getting a job that you feel really good about, that you could have an impact, that you could grow from, that you can have impact our community. Maybe that's a school teacher, or maybe that's a nurse, or maybe that's working in a business, and not having to rely on 5 random roommates from the back pages of the internet to afford an apartment. That's a young person's version of the American dream, right? And this is the first generation, as we can see in this data, that is unsure whether they will have a better level of financial stability than their parents. One of the things that we focused on in the last couple of semesters is this idea of financial independence. that this is something that younger people really strive for in this next phase of their lives. It doesn't necessarily mean be financially independent and can be wealthy. It just means being able to live outside of like excruciating debt and be able to, again, live that simple life that you spend a lot of time in focus groups and other open-ended questions analyzing this, didn't you?
Yeah, specifically, we posed a question in fall 2021 that was open-ended, and it was to just fill in the blank to me, a good life is. And overwhelmingly, the most popular responses were rooted in the simplest of things. To have food, a roof over my head, a loving community, and a little extra to enjoy life around me. That was really profound because it really suggests that young people, struggling as they might be, aren't asking for much. The formula is not super complex with a lot of moving parts. It's just a couple key components that, if aligned, could really have a profound difference. And beyond the very tangible, immediate concerns about the economy and inflation that definitely drove a lot of young voters to the polls, I think it's also very valuable to contemplate how young people aren't just perceiving their own finances as they're contemplating independence and establishing themselves distinctly from their parents, but also that they're aware of others around them. And so even for those for whom the American dream seems very attainable, those who say, my personal finances are okay, I think I'm on track to do better than my parents, there's this awareness about maybe that's not the case for everyone. So for instance, in spring 2022, our poll before this one, we actually asked a question about student loan debt forgiveness. And 9 in 10 young Americans desired some form of action to be taken on student loan debt by the government. Maybe that was helping with repayment, canceling all student loan debt, but only 1 in 10 said, do nothing, we're fine as is. So that speaks to this environmental and collective perceptibility of where we are as an economy. And I'll also add a tracking question we've posed to young people for the last decade or so has found that increasingly, with almost a point increase by each year, young people desire the government to do more to lift up those who are in poverty. So not only do we care about others and their personal economic situations, even when we ourselves are doing okay, but also we want the government to do more to help out those in need. And I think that trend is on track to continue influencing young people, not only in their own behavior and how they spend and save money, but also in how they vote, which influences everyone else.
Well, I'd like to shift a little bit towards polling more broadly, and you talked about doing focus groups. I'd love to get into a little bit of the nitty-gritty about that, but I think first I'll pull up a tweet that you put out a little while ago. Despite I can't read that far. Despite rigor and thoughtfulness that we used, I remember when it was basically hard to get people to pay attention to the Harvard Youth Poll, and now there are so many polls out there that are not rigorous, that are not forthright with their limitations, that are getting attention on news networks. So I wanted you to talk a little bit to that, but I also wanted to point out, you had a tweet go very viral last night, so congratulations.
Many of you saw it, right?
8 million people saw it, and counting. But I wanted to also say, as important, you have now been given a room rater rating of a 10 out of 10. So if you're not familiar, there's a Twitter account called Room Rater. They rate people's art and environment in this period of COVID and post-COVID, what their background looks like. So congratulations on that 10 out of 10.
I worked really hard on that.
But let's go back to this point about the Harvard Youth Poll compared to other polls. What kind of pieces of advice can you tell viewers who are looking at polls and looking at polling results? What key factors should they be looking for what makes a good poll versus what makes maybe a more newsworthy poll that might not be as accurate? What kind of factors should people be looking for?
Right. So I never believed there was going to be a red wave. And the reason I did not believe that is because the most reliable polls showed relatively little movement over the last year.
And which of those would you say are
The
reliable?
ones that have an extended track record, like ABC, Washington Post, NBC, CBS, Battleground Tracker. Those three have, they do regular polling, they have large, robust sample sizes, and they have a history, not just, they have a history over years, if not decades, of being reflective of the mood of the electorate based upon their, how close they see the popular vote, especially in midterm years. So those are the ones I spend the most time looking at. The reason I'm able to do that is because they share their data, right? Oftentimes I have 1,000 or a couple of thousand plus interviews. So all of us can access those and see the differences or similarities between Democrats, Republicans, Independents, male, female, based upon ideology, level of education, et cetera. You can get in to see the poll. You can get comfortable with the data. I often compare those youth-oriented data sets with our own, like more or less tracking the same way. When we see a 2-to-1 preference for Democrats and theirs, as well as for ours, it's a good poll. I've got a lot of confidence in that. What we saw in this last cycle is relative to 2018, there was less polls available, okay, to review, and a larger percentage of those polls were what I argued were less rigorous from organizations with less history, with opaque methods, with unknown sponsors. Let's talk about that, because this is a serious issue that's driving how we collectively think about public opinion in this country. In both 538 as well as Real Clear Politics, or aggregators, they both publish these polls. Okay, so let's go through these one at a time here. Okay, a little history. Some of these companies have not been in existence more than one election cycle. We have no idea what kind of track record they have, right? So I'm going to look at those in a more skeptical view.
So they don't have much experience with.
How much experience they have? Have they done their job before? Opaque methods. Share your data. You know, are you collecting information on the internet, telephone? What's the combination? Share your methodology so we could see that. Specifically, share cross-steps. Mm-hmm. You know, there are several pollsters out there that are adding their numbers into these averages that don't literally share their crosstabs or the full questionnaire.
And can you elaborate on crosstabs a little bit? So, and if you go to the Harvard youth poll, you'll find crosstabs. What does that mean, A?
Yeah.
And what are some of the limitations on, I don't mean to get too wonky here,
Sure.
but the limitations of the sample size and being able to evaluate those crosstabs effectively?
So our survey, every semester we conduct at least 2,000 interviews, okay? That means we have a margin of error of less than 3% overall. The reason we conduct so many interviews is because we want to understand the differences based upon where people live, or whether you're a college student or a graduate or in community college or never attended. We want to look at some of the subgroups within the electorate, okay?
So the more you break people down into these smaller and smaller categories,
The larger sample size you need, okay? So with each sample size, you're seeing less reliability, okay? So we'll talk to 1,000 men and 1,000 men and 1,000 women, but we can also look at white men versus white women, white men, you know, with an education that extends beyond high school versus others, et cetera, et cetera. Generally, crosstabs, subsamples of 100, 150, are a reliable directional indicator if things are in the right direction, okay? That has a margin of error of 7, 8, 9% based upon how low you get, but at least directionally, it should be pointing in the right direction, right? Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where we cut things off, okay? So those are the crosstabs. It's really kind of interesting to see, you know, where the differences are among some of these groups, okay? And we color code them on the IOP website so you can see if there's a color on it, there's a significant difference. No mm-hmm. color, you don't need to be a statistician, no difference, okay? So that's often what I do. I go in to look at these other polls to see whether they're sharing the crosses and how reliable. And I see a lot of problems within them. But the biggest issue, okay, is who the sponsor is. It's not easy to do polling. It's not easy to do polling every single night, an election year, tabulating that data, putting presentations together. And there's one pollster, a Trafalgar group, that has a poll out, 11 polls this week. I don't know who sponsored them. I don't know what their agenda is. I don't know how they collected the data. Don't know what their methodology is. I don't know what questions they ask. All I know is they thought that the New Hampshire Senate race was a toss-up. They thought the New York race was a toss-up. They thought that the Oregon race was a toss-up. None of them were toss-ups. None of them were close, okay? But it fed the narrative that this was going to be a red wave, right? So that's my frustration in these tweets from a researcher is it took us a decade to get folks to pay attention to an academically rigorous report on young people, right? Mm-hmm. It takes some of these other groups no time at all to be a part of the 538 and the Real Clear Politics aggregation sites, which are changing the narrative and which has dire consequences, especially if the election results are different than what the polls suggest. Because people, who believe in conspiracies could think that the election results were tainted in some way. So my concern is that a new arm of propaganda and PR in this country is based upon sponsoring polls that are being infiltrated, that are part of this narrative. I think that both aggregation sites really need to take a deep look at their responsibility and clean this up.
So let's switch over to the book, this book that was published last year. One of my students, Rebecca, noticed that many adults dismiss the anxieties that Gen Z faces, and she noted that reading Fight has been a nice change of pace and was very validating. I heard this from a lot of my students who were required to read your book for my class. Rebecca wanted to know, how do you communicate this validity and sort of help older adults understand where Gen Z is coming from, and how do you convince them to try and take Gen Z more seriously?
I think that's often the question when I ask younger people, like, what they need from us as adults. They often say, help us break through. That they're real, what the underlying causes of our concerns are, and that you can't just say, don't be stressed anymore. Jing-Jing alludes to the fact that, listen to this for a second, that half of young Americans, more days than not, the last 2 weeks, dealing with some significant form of anxiety, hopelessness, or depression. The younger you are, the more likely to have it. Doesn't matter if you live in a rural community or in the middle of a city, college and non-college one. 25% say, 70 million people in this generation, 25% say it is so bad, the weight is so heavy, that they have thought about self-harm or death several days in the last 2 weeks. 5% say this every single day.
5% say they've thought about self-harm
Yes.
or death every single day.
Every single day, last 2 weeks. Which means that on this campus, and in every high school in the state, and in every high school in America, you've got a handful, a dozen or more young people doing this every single day. And what they want their parents and their adults to recognize is it's real, and if I can help explain where these challenges and stresses are coming from, it's a real responsibility I feel. And I say to kind of the parents and the adults I talk to, is that you don't need to agree with their politics or their perceptions or vision, but let me walk you through some of the more significant ways in which the life has approached them. Let me break it down in ways that you can perhaps understand, so you can kind of to deal with this. As one example, people brush off, student loan debt's not a big deal, right? Or snowflakes, or this, that, or the other thing. Well, I remind them that when they were likely going to college, you could work a part-time job, you could work a minimum wage job for a summer and pay for a private or public year of tuition. Impossible to do now, right? So when I think the right, mostly the right, calls your generation snowflakes, I kind of get almost offended myself now, right? And I said, despite all those things I've talked about, I think these challenges have made you like harder, stronger, more resilient, the opposite of snowflakes, right? And despite all these stresses and all these anxieties, what's remarkable is I would understand, if you kind of checked out and said, you know what, I got to focus on myself. I'm not going to deal with some of these other issues, right? But that you, this generation cares as much about other people, the future, as themselves, and they're choosing, to spend this time to try and make themselves feel better by having some agency and doing something, but also trying to kind of correct the systemic failures that we've left for them.
Jing-Jing, if I can follow up with you, one of our speakers earlier this semester was the CEO and founder of the Listen First Project, Pierce Godwin, who talks about the power of listening. From someone in Gen Z, what kinds of things do you wish older generations would listen to you on? What kinds of issues or concerns, other than mental health, I think is one that has come up a lot, but are there other things that you would like older adults to listen to you specifically, in your generation?
Can I put in a request for everything? That would be ideal. But to go back to mental health just briefly, the fact that we have bipartisan support for increased governmental assistance with regard to mental health concerns preceding the pandemic, and the very alarming and unbudging numbers that John touched on for feeling down, depressed, or hopeless, and self-harm, this most recent poll, but also over the last several, points to the fact that there is this consensus amongst our generation that the mental health crisis unfolding is very much real, and we need to validate that in order to address it. But beyond mental health and well-being, you have a bunch of other threats that young people perceive to their lives, and that oftentimes it seems as though there's a disconnect with older generations in taking that seriously. So one is climate change. In our fall 2021 poll, we noted that almost half, I think it was like 47% of young Americans reported already perceiving the effects of climate change in their own communities. Like, that's alarming, like across the country. And just over half said that the government should do more about climate change. And that paid dividends over the summer with the Inflation Reduction Act, but it absolutely doesn't end there. So that is one instance of, it's not just our personal survival and mental health that matters, but also our survival on this planet. Like, that is in jeopardy, and we're going to be around to live with the consequences of the action that gets taken or fails to get taken today. Beyond this, survival of our democracy also figures front and center. The fact that there's so much polarization perceived in our governmental leadership, even when our own everyday communities aren't that different. To give you some idea of this, 1 in 2 young Americans say that people with opposing beliefs or ideas, viewpoints, still want what's best for the country. I think that speaks volumes about how highly we regard each other and productive discourse. And for older generations that might dismiss us and say, Gen Z doesn't know what they're talking about, they're apathetic, they don't care, or they can't agree on anything, that's just not what the data shows. If 3 in 4 young Americans in 2020 can tell us that we desire more open-mindedness in politics, that also shows we're willing to engage not only with each other when we have diverse viewpoints, but also with other generations. And we're going to need everyone together in this fight for the future. So if we're willing to listen and validate each other's concerns and find common ground and work together, that is absolutely actualizable.
Thanks for the plug.
Absolutely.
Well, and I'm hearing also in your answer, I interviewed David Hogg for this conversation last year, who writes the foreword to your book. And one thing that I found remarkable from David Hogg, who's running this kind of the March for Our Lives against or for gun control in this country, he said he's like, you can disagree with me or agree with me, but what has to happen is that we need to come together as generations and not see each other as distinct from each other. If we want to make change, you have to find a way to reach across those different generations. So thinking about other generations, I think a lot of times we look back to and sort of romanticize. I think young people in the 1960s, in the civil rights movement, and the movement towards LGBTQ acceptance. Elijah had a question that is about a speech that recently happened here at UD. The Reverend Al Sharpton stated that Gen Z needs a goal similar to the baby boomers of the 60s, and they need a specific goal to set them on a steering course forward. First of all, do you agree that they need a goal similar to baby boomers of the 60s? And if so, what goal do we as a generation, or we, as Elijah says, as a generation need to emphasize, to maximize achievements for us and for our children in the future? Do we need a second sort of 1960s revolution movement, or does what's happening with young people look different, fundamentally different today?
I think it's fundamentally different today, but I think if there was a goal, this is the first time I've been asked this question, I think the goal should be civic participation, right? That currently the U.S. ranks around 28 in terms of the number of young Americans who vote. In this generation, I think, unlike other generations, has determined, as Jing-Jing talked about, like the series of challenges we have today, there is an urgency that requires young people, even though they may not like it. Like, I may not like to go to the dentist. I may not like to spend time at jury duty, but it's my civic responsibility, or it's good for my health, in the former, right? And this generation thinks the same way about voting. They may not like the characters. They may be disappointed in the results, but they believe it's a civic responsibility. And I think that could be a goal, right? And that we went from averaging less than 20% to the mid-30s just in these midterm elections. But if we had a goal where younger people participated, not just in the presidential, by the way, we have a different president today because of young people. Donald Trump won the vote of everybody over the age of 40 in Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. Those are the 5 states that went from red to blue because of young people. Now, for younger people, Trump is in the office. We don't have KBJ, the first African-American woman on the Supreme Court, and all the accomplishments that Jing-Jing talked about, whether you like them or not. It's a different country. So imagine the way our schools would be run, right? And the allocation of resources, for example, for mental health, if young people participated, even at this level, in local elections. So I think if there were a goal, perhaps it could be a goal of 50% participation in local elections, in the next 10 years or something reasonable. And that we all focused on that, parents, educators, mentors, coaches, each other. Something like that could be attainable and change the country overnight.
So just like you wouldn't skip your 6-month dental cleaning, make sure you go and vote. I think that's an interesting goal. So let's talk a little bit about, again, this kind of disconnect or a perceived disconnect between younger generations and older generations. Keyshawn asked, why do you think there is such a generation gap in terms of political views? Why is it when Gen Z members talk about their realities, say the job market or housing, the older generation sees a disconnect, that they don't understand what Gen Z goes through? What are the value differences between older generations and younger generations? And again, how can they sort of find ways to communicate across those differences? And maybe Jing-Jing can speak to that in terms of, again, kind of what kind of conversations would you like to have with older generations so they understand where you're coming from?
I think a lot of the struggles that we have gone through and are going through are also shared with older generations. Like, in that sense, there is that common experience. There are profound differences in, I think, magnitude or severity. For instance, the ability to go to college and to look at that tuition and realize, like, you can't save up for that in like a summer or two. Like, that's something that very much our generation feels that maybe our grandparents' generation might not be able to connect with as much because it was just a different reality back then. In addition, these perceived risks of misinformation and disagreements about our sources of news and data, there was already going to be disagreement about policy, about politics, and that's natural and honestly healthy in a democracy. But where we can't agree on facts and election results, like, that really cuts at the integrity of the processes that form the bedrock of society. So even with this most recent midterm election with 1 in 3 young Republicans and 1 in 3 young Democrats fearing that there might be some interference in the election and that it would maybe come from the other party most likely, that doesn't portend well for an election in which you would desire high faith in the process. So the divergent and inconsistent bases upon which we form our beliefs, upon which we talk about policy, because that seems even more fractured and fragile now, I think that poses a challenge that is particularly severe for Gen Z, though not insurmountable, as I'm sure we will touch on later. And we can learn a lot from past generations and all that they've gone through, the progress that they have enabled for us to build on. Like, it is very much there. It's just recognizing we are different generations, we have different experiences, but we're all trying to ultimately make the most of our lives, have a net positive impact on the world, find meaning in what we do, and that common ground is absolutely a vehicle through which we can connect with each other.
Can I offer just one other observation?
Please.
That was so perfect. I don't know if I should, but the observation I will make is that what oftentimes stops them in their tracks is when I talk about the trauma and the chaos, not to diminish anyone else's experience, right? All generations, all individuals have their own struggles, and I would never kind of diminish or misrepresent that. However, despite the chaos that we saw around Vietnam and Watergate, et cetera, there were collective moments where all Americans across our differences came together.
9/11.
Okay, one of my first experiences, 1980, as a young boy, watching the U.S. beat the Soviets in the Miracle on Ice. 9/11, I think one of the differentiators between are you in the millennial camp or a Gen Zer camp is your memory, recognition of 9/11, but also September 12th and 13th, when regardless of what neighborhood you lived in, what your political ideology was, if you had a flag, you put it on the front door, you hung it up, right? And we had that collective experience of feeling united. One of the most challenging questions I can ask a young person in any setting is, when was the last time you felt proud to be an American, right? Or when America is united. They cannot name that, perhaps a sporting event. But other than that, it's a really challenging question. And that's something that I think helps older people think about how younger people think about themselves, their country, and our relationship with others around the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're about to get to questions, and I'll ask Millie and Kate to come over to our microphones. There you guys are, and we'll get set up. So if you have a question, be thinking about that. And but as we transition to that, I have another question from Anna. And this is for you, John. What's maybe one factor, one thing that's changed the most since you began with the Harvard Youth Poll to now, other than some things you've already mentioned? What's surprised you most about what's changed, or maybe what's stayed the same?
Well, obviously the methodology. 22 years ago, you may not appreciate the fact that there were actually landlines in dorms that people would answer, and that there was a relatively small number who offered up their cell phones. So clearly the methodology has changed in a significant way. I still think one of the biggest surprises, so this is an interesting, I think, question. A margin of error of 5 points means that essentially 1 in 20 surveys has an underlying a problem with a sample, and it's unreliable, and we do it again. So you do enough polls, you start to see a data set that doesn't look quite right, so you do it again. So it's been a long time now. It's probably a decade ago, where we have this student named Jeffrey, and he was with us for all 4 years, and he was I think in a biology major. He had a hard time coming up with questions, and I was like, really hope he could come up with something really good for his last semester, and he finally did. And he says, we're uncomfortable with political and other kinds of labels. I want to see what identities younger people kind of assume we're going to connect with. So we had a dozen of these different labels, one of which was capitalism, one of which was socialism, and patriots and feminists, and just a variety of things. And what I found was that less than half the people supported or connected with capitalism. Less than half. Fewer supported socialism. I went to Catherine McLaughlin, who at that time was running the IOP. I said, I think there's a problem. I think this is the 5%. I think we need to do another poll. I don't really trust this data. I did another poll, and I found it wasn't until we surveyed people over the age of 50 where there was like net support for capitalism. That's a significant, no one had talked about this before, right? I then argued to find a little bit more money to go out and do some focus groups to get some understanding of it. And it was such an impactful series of weeks for us, because what I learned was not necessarily a rejection of capitalism, rejection of the way in which capitalism is being practiced today, which led into, obviously, the Occupy movement and helped us understand those factors. And really, when we spent time talking with young people, and I talked a little bit about this in Fight, is that they're asking not for socialism, but for a more modern, more fair, more moral capitalism. One, as a student from Franklin Marshall College at the time, reminded me, looked a little bit more like if the Roosevelts got together. Square deal, New Deal, right? Where we might make it more challenging for monopolies to operate on one hand, while at the other hand we might provide some social infrastructure to help Americans move forward. So that's just an example of something and how we had to respond to that over the course of the last couple decades doing this.
That's fascinating. Okay, I'd like to open it up to questions from the audience. So if we could bring the house lights up a little bit so I can see our audience. Who would like to ask the first question? Of one or both of our speakers. Just
we
raise
see a
your
hand over here. Second row.
Hi, John. So this question's for you. I wanted to ask, so you mentioned in your book, Fight, how Zoomers opened up to you in a way that millennials never have. I wanted to ask you, what did that exactly look like, and what were their common fears?
Well, it's a great question. Thank you. So at the end of every semester in the summertime, I spend traveling around the country conducting qualitative research sessions, large like these, small and mid-size. And I ask with the basic questions. And often I think this is actually good advice for anyone to model, to have productive conversations. I'd ask before about the topic, if I was going to focus on a conversation about climate change or education or whatever the issue is, I'd start with getting to know each other, building some trust and some rapport, saying, what's a good day, right? What keeps you up at night? What are some of the challenges? What are some of the things that connect us as Americans, connect you as a generation? Give me a word or phrase or image from your phone that might describe America today. Those are the kinds of questions I've been asking them for, at that point, 15 years. 2017, I walked into a room in Columbus, Ohio, and I just kind of met with a completely different kind of vibe. Dystopic, off the rails, a bloody mess, terrified. Those are the questions that young people, offered up immediately in terms of the America they were dealing with. Okay, what are the things that connect us? I was ready to hear opportunity. That's what I heard the previous several years, regardless of where in the country I was. Instead, I heard fear. I said, fear of what? And I have the exact quote, and this young woman rattled it off like she'd been preparing for it for her entire life. She said, fear of death, fear for our children, fear for our health, going through, right? Basically what young Americans are dealing with today, this was 5 years ago. And then I said, what don't we understand? She goes, you know what, someone else said this, the way you guys, older guys, think about money, taxes, that's the way we think about living and dying every time we walk into an auditorium, just like this. That's the way that we carry, right? That just hit me like a ton of bricks. Wherever I was around the country, I was hearing the same things. It's nearly impossible to talk to a group of African-American men or women where most of them don't know someone who's been a victim of gun violence. Mostly impossible. It is mostly impossible to talk to any group of teenagers, white, black, Hispanic, Latino, Asian American, doesn't matter, several of them have an experience around sexual assault or sexual violence. Same thing goes for young people dealing with depression and the effects of suicide. These are just random samples of people I'm taking all over, right? And that was just like a game changer. And then when I followed up a little bit, I realized that for the first time, I think there was a connection between the disquiet in our politics and these additional stresses. So that's when I really began to see if there was this disconnect. And honestly, I think we were among the first to really kind of put these two pieces together. And that was before Charlottesville, before Las Vegas, and before Parkland. The combination of those events really just made everything that much worse. And we're thankful that, I talk about this in the book, that David Hogg's parents chose that school because of their media capabilities and the opportunity that he could have to tell a story. And he insisted that he was going to use this moment, when the cameras were there, to try to awaken the other Americans. And I was able to watch. Again, our polling showed an overnight change, 12-point change. And we talk about this wave. That wave was just beginning to develop during those times. And pollster after pollster were quoting the same articles as I was in the New York Times. You can look at them. They said, we don't see any wave. We don't see any difference. Young people never vote. Well, they weren't voting yet, but they were registering. Wherever March for Our Lives rolled up, Chicago, Parkland, Boston, Cincinnati, voter registration went up. What happened in the summertime? AOC knocks off Joe Crowley, number 2 and number 3 person in the House. What happens again in November? It happened. And that's when I wrote the book proposal, because they took all this fear, all of this anxiety, and they channeled it into a pretty important place to make themselves feel better, to heal the country. And again, we know we're living in a better place because of it. So thank you for all of you who went out and voted whenever you have an opportunity. It's important.
Thank you. Do we have another question from the audience?
Thank you. Hi. My question was, did you notice any particular campaigns, I guess, this time around that did a pretty good job of garnering the Gen Z vote, what strategies they were able to use? And do you think that'll be because of this Gen Z wave, do you feel like that'll reduce skepticism around the voter turnout for Gen Z? I mean, obviously there's so much to be done, but in the current state, there was quite a bit of turnout in comparison to previous years. So do you think that'll reduce skepticism?
I'm an optimist, and I hope so. But we've been doing this for such a long time that it's hard to change, I guess, old habits. I don't really know. I think the most compelling stories aren't from campaigns; they're from people. They're from Aiden Cohn Murphy, who was a frustrated high school student, who leveraged his TikTok handle with other people and created a Gen Z for Change, right? Where I think they reach 500 million people, this network, and there are other people like him, Santiago Meyer, who started an organization called Voters of Tomorrow. 4 years ago, he was in high school in Mexico, and now he's one of the most influential young organizers in America, if not the world, right? So that's where the real, quote, change is coming from. But I will tell you, not only because that I served on President Biden's campaign, it's because of this bottom-up energy, recognized and empowered from the administration, specifically the White House, right? Where they included, they've got these weekly talkers, right? So folks who go on TV get these talking points. Well, you know what? Younger people who are talking to their friends and their communities and their peers also get these talking points. They get invited to White House events to celebrate the passage of the IRA, just like members of Congress in the districts in where you live. They empower them, they recognize them, and those are the young people who did all the work that made yesterday possible from a Democrat's point of view. They did literally, one group did 1 million phone calls. 1 million phone calls, right? So I think this happened not in spite of President Biden, but because of President Biden and his administration. Because unless you're in regular conversations with the front lines of these organizers, these relational organizers, not about TV, it's about these relational organizers, which people like us don't see. Unless you're connecting with them, they're not motivated to make the case to their friends and their colleagues. I was just on the phone with a reporter. This was a theory I came up with today, actually, and he had indicated the exact same story from an organizer who said they really relied on student debt and climate to move over some of these late deciding people, but they felt they wouldn't be doing this if they didn't feel comfortable, authentic with that sort of connection. So I think we'll see, how this develops, but I think it's a really kind of important way to understand politics of the future through these relationships and this access to decision makers.
Thank you very much. Let's take another question from the audience. How about somebody over on this side? Thank you.
In the last couple of agendas, we talked about some of the problems with polling, small sizes. MSNBC had an issue about creating the fake polls so that they could then, if they lose the election, claim, well, the polls said that I was going to win. How come I didn't win? There's got to be something wrong with the vote.
Right.
How do you see your industry progressing from where we are now to new methodology? I'm a guy who owns a landline, so when you said landline, I'm going, yeah, I got one. And have people respond. I never answer the phone if I don't know that,
Right.
who it is. But how do you see yourself progressing so the polling becomes more reliable, more worthy of us actually paying attention
Yeah.
to, and then we get better results so that when the national media says, 538 says that, Fetterman is going to lose because he's behind odds. Well, we come to find out that he kind of crushed him. He really did. The crudité thing really did it. But I'm just asking, how do you see your industry improving?
So, a couple things. One is I'm not sure I associate with a lot of the folks who are doing those kinds of polls, right? A couple different, and that's an issue in itself, right? You have for not you, but like I would understand if you viewed, kind of me skeptically based upon how other people who have the same title approach their work. Okay, so that's one thing that we need to kind of get over, right? What makes our work, I think, unique and has the longevity of it is I'm not going to just tell you who's going to win or who's going to lose at the youth vote. I'm going to tell you why. I'm going to tell you and where, and not only why, but what the values are that led to them having this particular kind of opinion, right? Go well beyond whatever that top line kind of number is, because that's actually the least important number as far as I'm concerned, right?
And just like you explained crosstabs, could you explain the top line a little bit?
The top line number is the percent of people who say they're going to vote for this person or that person, okay?
So it's just a raw number that
raw number. It's like, Fetterman's 48, Oz is 46. I call them that the top line number. I say that's the least important because what's more important is where is that 48% coming from? How is he doing in Western PA versus Eastern PA? What is he doing with men who are in college versus men not in college? How does that compare to Pat Toomey's race? How does that compare to Joe Biden's race? Why not? That's what pollsters do, right? Instead, what's happened is the combination of Real Clear and then Nate Silver aggregating everything, focusing everybody on who's going to win or who's going to lose, I think has really devalued the value that we can provide the public in terms of understanding public opinion. Does that make sense? Right? Jing-Jing talked about the value of young Americans, sorry to correct you, is 8 out of 10, not quite 9 out of 10, believe that we should be doing something to relieve student debt, right? Whether that comes from the public, from the private, all or none, that's a helpful piece of information, and then we can dig a little bit deeper in terms of what's the right policy on that. So I'm hopeful that the aggregators have more rigorous techniques before they let people just publish their polls. One, I'm hopeful that they stop with these grades, A, B, C, based upon choosing a couple of races the right way, even though it could be completely by accident.
So this is evaluating different pollsters by giving them a grade.
Yeah.
like an academic grade.
Like an academic grade, I think that's ridiculous, right? And instead, what we need to do is we need to be more flexible and more thoughtful in terms of how we reach people. The New York Times has done a really great job recently experimenting. I'll just give you one example, and then this information is shared within our industry. But they just released an experiment, I think it was actually on Election Day, maybe a day or two ago, where they conducted a poll the traditional way, cell phone and landline, the way in which they do it in Wisconsin. And then they affixed a $5 bill and mailed a survey to a number of other people to see what would get a better response. Their hypothesis was that shy Trump voters, people who won't pick up the telephone, may be more responsive to a mailer, maybe feel a little bit guilty for taking a $5 bill up to $20 in exchange for their opinions. Okay, so folks like the New York Times and others are experimenting in different ways to identify better coverage. Mm-hmm. What they found was there was no difference. The person who took the money versus who didn't take the money, okay, had no difference in their political opinion. And by the way, that doesn't mean that both were wrong. You know, one of the mistakes that I think our industry makes is just because we had an error around shy Trump voters or not finding less educated, white
in 2016,
men in 2016 or 2018, that they'll necessarily repeat. Okay, so one of the mistakes I think that people made here this year, overcorrecting for that while missing the wave that we talked about earlier. Looking for one thing, but the youth wave comes up. So, the way we do it at the Institute of Politics, we don't care about what technology you use. We choose you based on your address, based upon where you live. The way Gallup did it almost 100 years ago, okay? And then we provide you then you can provide us with data, your cell phone, your tablet, your desktop. You can give it to us at 2 o'clock in the morning. You can wait 3 days at your leisure as long as you do it. And if for some reason you don't have technology, we'll actually pay to give you the technology in exchange for your opinions. I mean, it's a very expensive way to do it, but it's the reason that we're able to sit here with confidence to tell you what just happened.
And I think I'll add to that you want to make sure that the organization that you're looking at is a trustworthy one and that they have a good track record, and you're looking at the methods. And I think that it does require a little bit of effort on the part of the viewers and the audience to hold these polling organizations to more accountability and asking for basic statistics like margin of error and statistical significance. Without getting too wonky about it, I think you can really identify what makes a good poll, what makes a bad poll. Speaking of polls, I want to plug for our students in the audience that one of the projects that my students work on in National Agenda, the class, is every year we do the Blue Hen Poll, which is a survey for students by students, and we are able to gauge the opinions and attitudes of students on the University of Delaware campus. So that will be going out to a random sample of students in the next day or two. So if you do get invited to take that survey, recognize that some of these folks in the front row here who are in my class need you to respond to help them get some data to analyze for their project. Let's take maybe one more question. Tim? Sorry. I happen to see that it's Tim.
I was going to say, if you'd rather have a student ask a question, mine's a slightly wonky question for John.
Let's do.
I'll be quick, and then we'll hand it off over.
Can't Jing-Jing get the wonky one? All right, I'll take it.
Well, we'll see. Well, I mean, it actually kind of builds off of the question that was just asked a moment ago. You talked about kind of Gallup 100 years ago, and so the name that was kind of in my mind is Dan Yankelovich, right? And some of this kind of work around public judgment, and the way that you were speaking about, and I think what we've just kind of navigated, right? Watching all these gauges of toss-ups and all this sort of stuff, and I think we've become slightly accustomed to leaning into that and almost expecting it to be just accurate, right? And if it's not, then it's this real kind of big question around these surveys. But folks like Gallup and Yankelovich and others, they spoke about and did work kind of in this vein of kind of public judgment, right? Of leaning into doing public opinion polling, but with this, slightly more substantive kind of trying to get at what was going on. So it's not just this kind of gauge, but really trying to understand what was underneath, right? Not just that kind of short term. So can you speak at all to how, because I kind of read between the lines, and I know we've had some interactions in the past, but to what extent does the way that you do the polling, and you maybe alluded a little bit a moment ago to this gets a little bit more at this, not just taking a temperature check in that moment, but to think about it in a more kind of long-term fashion, or what moves us as he would talk about it, this kind of judgment from not being informed to truly being an informed and possibly kind of an engaged person from that.
So generally, there's every poll is art and science. I'm not much of a scientist. I'm more of the artist in terms of, I don't know much about math or statistics, to be honest with you, right? My skill is asking questions and surrounding myself with interesting people who like to ask questions. I rely a lot on qualitative research, okay? A lot of those kinds of questions. What's a good day, right? And then if you lead to that, like, what role does government have, and those sorts of things. So I lean heavily on developing thoughtful questions in ways that Americans are kind of living their lives. That's kind of one part that I think is somewhat unique. I'm not going to call you up and start asking you a bunch of questions about a Supreme Court case you never heard about. It's not going to really impact your life, right? A lot of other polls do that. That's one. The second thing is we did this early with consideration and participation with the students to kind of understand not just what party ID, but typology, that we can measure over time. I'm so thankful that we did, inspired by the World Value Survey and some of the other academic work, is to develop, again, what Jing-Jing said was not do you support or oppose a particular program, but do you believe government should spend more or less time helping those who are needy? Do you believe we should be engaging in the world of free trade? Those sorts of things that we can kind of measure over time and see where these opinions form and where the clusters are, right? And where the divisions within society are. So our work is heavily based upon qualitative with a real mix of academic rigor, academic questions, but also very, very practical things that if you've got a minute or two to spend telling a story, to help an elected official connect with a younger person to get them to hopefully build faith in the process and vote, can also provide that practical aspect of it well. It's a very unique set of tools, all of which are driven by and inspired by people like Jing-Jing and by your Blue Hen pollsters and other young people, because they're the ones who are curious, and I'm just trying to help them develop a frame to help them understand the things that they care about.
Well, I think building on that question and the previous one is understanding that again, public opinion polling is both an art and a science, and you kind of need an understanding of both of those things. And then also to keep in mind that most of these polls that you're looking at are what we call cross-sectional polls, which means it's one sample of people at one point in time. And I think we all know that things can change from one day to the next in terms of how you feel about something. So you have to kind of take those polls with a grain of salt. I think we have time for one more student question right here, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. Thank you.
So you had mentioned that the letter grades that are given to polls are pretty untrustworthy. What would be the first thing that you would want informed people or smart readers to look for if you see a poll built into an article and you want to check that it's a trustworthy poll? What would be the
first thing
that you look into?
For you, names of organizations that you've heard of, nice place to start. Okay, and then look into those, read the questionnaire, or look into those crossouts, and just look at yourself, okay? You are a young person under 30 or under 44 based upon what the cross-out is. Read through the cross-outs from your perspective, okay? And say, is this the way I think people like me feel, okay? And that will just kind of give you, that's the way I do it, right? That's going to give you a little bit of a sense of, okay, this feels kind of right, okay? I'll give you just a couple quick things. Like YouGov and The Economist, Politico, Morning Consult, like these, they do really large samples. They're online, and they ask tons and tons and tons of questions. They're accessible. You can look at a lot of those crossouts. They're not necessarily the best at predicting within a point or two what's going to happen, but they're going to ask a lot of interesting questions that you can kind of get some sense of and get familiar with that. YouGov, Economist, Politico, Morning Consult, similar kind of methodologies. All of it is available online, and you can really kind of spend some time with.
And I think I'll point out too, as a professor of political communication, that that polls make an easy news story for a lot of journalists, and the horse race isn't always the most important part of the story about what's happening with a Fetterman versus Oz, for example, to bring up the example from earlier, and that journalists are under deadlines and they need to get stories out, and sometimes they'll report on this kind of horse race between two people in a race because it's the newest thing about the story. So we don't always get a great crudité story like the Fetterman one. You guys can look that up if you don't know what I'm talking about. But I think we have to kind of take those kinds of polls and those sorts of news stories with a little bit of caution and not just jump in, oh, he's 1 point higher than he was yesterday. So I want to thank our speakers, but before I do, I have just a couple of brief announcements as we wrap up here. I want to finally remind folks that we are continuing our tradition of doing an audio and now video essay. We're asking students and people in the University of Delaware community to connect and submit a video or audio recording about our theme, which is politics by the numbers, and what it means to you. When have you been? Why are you more than a number? You know, we're talking about polls. Why are you more than a Gen Zer under a particular age in Delaware as a white or male student, for example? Why are you more than that? Share a message with our community. We are accepting videos and audio messages through December 9th. There is also a competition. We offer awards, cash prizes for some of these essays, and then we publish them in the spring for the University of Delaware community to hear, like you were saying, qualitative perspectives or real voices beyond just those numbers that we see in the polls. So I think there's a real value in what you said tonight, in that we need to hear the numbers and know, like, okay, what's the bigger picture? What do young people think about? But then what are some of those stories that resonate? And then I also want to remind folks that some other students in my class are engaging around campus in these free intelligent conversations. We had some of these over dinner this evening. Similar to your question on what does a good day look like, these questions come from a nonprofit organization that's intended to help people connect with each other across difference. That doesn't really matter what your party is or who you voted for, but what's something that moved you today, or what is a childhood memory that really resonates with you? These are the kind of conversations that I think we're all sort of like relearning to have post-COVID and in a very polarized world. I keep sort of joking, we're learning how to have conversations like in kindergarten. We're kind of relearning how to talk to each other kindly. And then I just want to say again to both of our speakers, wraps up our 12th year of National Agenda. Thank you to everyone for being at our events this year. Look forward to our 13th year next fall. My DMs are open if you want to follow me at @TheDocHoff if you're interested in submitting ideas for speakers or for themes for future years. We're always looking for input from students and from the community. With that, I want to give a big Blue Hen thank you to John Della Volpe and Jing-Jing Shen.
Thank you.